Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the BTK killer. And for this deep dive, we're using firsthand accounts from the Wondery podcast, 48 Classics Out of the Shadows.
All right.
We get to hear directly from victims' families and the law enforcement who worked tirelessly to solve this case.
This case, it really is a study in contrasts. BTK terrorized Wichita, Kansas for 30 years,
Yeah.
all while living a seemingly normal life as a husband, a father, an
Right.
active member of his community.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a double life, right?
Yeah.
This seemingly average guy was out there committing these horrific acts.
Yeah.
And no one had a clue. So the question is, how did BTK manage to pull this off for so long? And what ultimately led to his capture?
Well, to truly understand this case, we need to go back to the beginning.
Mhm.
BTK, which stands for Bind, Torture, Kill, first emerged in the 1970s. His first murders in January of 1974 sent shockwaves through Wichita. An entire family of the Ottos were found murdered in their home.
Oh, wow. And this is where it gets really disturbing, right? Among the victims were 9-year-old Joseph and 11-year-old Josephine. Josephine was found hanged from a basement pipe. Can you imagine the terror these children must have felt?
Absolutely. And that's the effect BTK wanted to have. From the very start, he craved attention, notoriety. He wasn't content with just committing these horrific acts. He needed the world to know it was him. So he communicated with the media, he left clues, and even took credit for the murders.
That's crazy. And he even called the police himself to report the murder of Nancy Fox in 1977. There's a recording of that call that is just chilling.
The call itself is eerie. His voice is so calm, almost detached as he describes what he's done. It's a stark reminder of the level of detachment and lack of empathy we are dealing with here.
Wow. So he terrorizes Wichita in the 70s, and then things seemed to go quiet for a while until 1986 with the murder of Vicki Wiggerly. This is where the case takes a really unexpected turn.
Yes, the Vicki Wiggerly case adds a layer of complexity. Because suspicion initially fell on her husband, Bill, he failed polygraph tests. And for 18 years, he lived under this cloud of suspicion.
It's hard to grasp the emotional toll that must have taken on Bill and his children. They were grieving the loss of Vicki while also facing scrutiny and accusations from their community. Talk about a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, and it's a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of tunnel vision in investigations. While focusing on Bill, investigators missed opportunities to connect Vicki's murder to BTK's previous crimes.
So BTK was still out there. He reemerged in 2004 after nearly 2 decades of silence. Why the sudden reappearance after all that time?
Well, it appears that BTK's ego, his desire for recognition, might have been a factor. A book about the BTK murders was published around that time, and some theorize he felt overshadowed, envious of the attention it was receiving. He wanted to remind everyone that he was still out there, still in control.
And how did he go about reminding everyone? I understand he started sending letters and packages again.
Yes, he began taunting the police and media with cryptic clues, much like he did in the 70s, but this time he took it a step further. He sent these incredibly disturbing dollgrams, dolls posed to represent his victims.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about those. One detail that stuck with me was the doll with a noose around its neck. Such a blatant and chilling reference to the murder of young Josephine Otto.
That's precisely the kind of symbolism BTK used to create terror and confusion. He was relishing the fear and speculation he was generating. He was playing a game, and he wanted everyone to know he was calling the shots.
But as the saying goes, pride comes before a fall. And BTK's need for attention ultimately led to his undoing. In a letter to the police, he asked if a computer disk could be traced if he sent it to them. They seized the opportunity and placed an ad in the local paper assuring him it wouldn't be. And guess what?
He took the bait. He sent the disc, and it led them straight to Dennis Rader.
Oh my gosh, what a blunder. Who would have thought that a seemingly simple question about technology could lead to their capture? Speaking of Dennis Rader, when they finally unmasked him, it sent shockwaves through Wichita, right?
Absolutely. Here was this man leading a double life, a dog catcher, a church leader, a family man, all the while hiding this horrifying secret.
It's unbelievable. And they found all sorts of disturbing evidence, like his mother lode, a collection of souvenirs from his killings hidden in his office. And then there were those creepy, slick ads, sexual fantasy cards he made using images of women and girls.
The fact that he kept these things in his office, a place associated with his public persona, is both shocking and revealing. It suggests a level of arrogance, a belief that he was untouchable.
You know, I was thinking about his job as a dog catcher and installing burglar alarms. He literally had access to people's homes. Was he scouting potential victims through his work?
It's a chilling thought, and it's something investigators explored. While there's no definitive proof that he used his work to target victims, It certainly adds another layer of complexity and raises questions about how deeply intertwined his double life truly was.
Once arrested, Rader confessed to all 10 murders, providing graphic details, but showing a shocking lack of remorse. But one big question remained. Why? What could possibly drive a seemingly ordinary man to commit such horrific acts?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? One of the most unsettling aspects of this case is that there doesn't seem to be a clear-cut answer to why. Rader didn't have a traumatic childhood. He was seemingly happily married, and he was an active member of his community. There's no obvious explanation for the darkness that lurked within him.
But even in his childhood, there were warning signs, wouldn't you say? He admitted to having a disturbing fascination with inflicting pain, starting with animals. And then there was his bizarre obsession with another serial killer, Harvey Glatman, who targeted young women in Hollywood in the 1950s.
You're right to point that out. Those early signs, coupled with his later fascination with Glatman, paint a disturbing picture of his psychological development. It seems that the seeds of his dark fantasies were planted early on, and his interest in true crime, particularly the notoriety of figures like Glatman, might have played a role in shaping his worldview.
And didn't he actually mirror some of Glatman's methods, like photographing his victims?
Yeah.
It's as if he was emulating his idol, trying to recreate the crimes that had captivated him.
Exactly. It raises important questions about the influence of true crime media, and whether, in certain cases, it can potentially inspire copycat crimes. It's a complex issue, and it's something we should definitely delve into further in our discussion.
For sure. But before we get to that, there's one more detail about Rader that I find particularly disturbing. He collected detective pulp magazines, especially those depicting women in bondage. Does this tell us anything about his motivations?
Absolutely. His obsession with these magazines, combined with his modus operandi of binding and torturing his victims, points to a deep-seated need for control and domination. It seems his crimes weren't just about taking lives. They were about exerting power, fulfilling his twisted fantasies of control over his victims.
It's terrifying to think that this seemingly ordinary man harbored such dark and disturbing desires. And what's even more unsettling is his response when asked why he never targeted his own wife.
His answer, he said his victims were just objects.
Objects? How can he be so callous, so devoid of empathy?
That statement speaks volumes about his distorted worldview. His victims were not people to him. They were merely pawns in his sick game. It's a chilling reminder of the dehumanizing nature of his crimes and the profound lack of remorse he exhibited.
You know, when you think about those slick ads he made, it's clear that this dehumanization was a core part of his fantasy world. He was objectifying women, reducing them to mere images to fuel his twisted desires.
It's a disturbing pattern, isn't it? The fascination with bondage, the dehumanizing language, the slick ads, all these pieces fit together to create a portrait of a man deeply disturbed and driven by a need for control and domination over women.
It's really hard to wrap your head around, especially knowing that he managed to keep this hidden for so long, fooling everyone around him.
That's exactly what makes this case so compelling and so terrifying. The fact that someone like Dennis Rader could exist among us, blend into our communities, and deceive everyone for decades is a sobering reminder of the complexities of human nature and the challenges of understanding evil.
It makes you question how well you can ever truly know another person. I mean, his own wife.
So let's talk about Paula Rader. Could she have truly been unaware of her husband's double life? It's a question that's been debated extensively.
I could see both sides.
Yeah.
On one hand, it's hard to believe she could have been completely oblivious, given the evidence found in their home.
Yeah.
The mother lode he kept at his office, his long absences.
Right. And those who find it hard to believe her innocence often point to the fact that he was meticulous in covering his tracks in other aspects of his life. Why wouldn't he have been just as careful at home?
On the other hand, the investigators who interviewed Paula, and even Rader's own lawyer, maintained that she was genuinely in the dark. They describe her as a kind, devout woman who was utterly devastated by her husband's crimes.
And if that's the case, it's a testament to Rader's ability to compartmentalize, to completely separate his dark side from his public persona.
It also raises questions about the dynamics of their relationship, the power imbalances that might have existed, and whether Paula consciously or unconsciously chose to ignore certain signs.
It's a complex and sensitive issue, and we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions or engage in victim blaming.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's an important aspect of the case to consider, especially when we're trying to understand how Rader was able to maintain his double life for so long.
Right. If Paula was truly unaware, it speaks volumes about his manipulative abilities, his skill at deception, and the lengths he went to protect his secret life.
It's chilling to think about.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into analyzing Paula's role, I want to go back to the victims and their families. During Rader's sentencing, they had the opportunity to confront him directly, sharing powerful impact statements, expressing their pain, anger, and profound sense of loss.
Those impact statements are incredibly moving. They give a voice to the victims, reminding us that behind the headlines and the sensationalism, there are real people whose lives were tragically cut, short families shattered forever.
One statement that really stuck with me was from Steve Ralford, whose mother was murdered by Rader in 1977. Steve was just a child at the time, but he spoke about the guilt he carried for letting Rader into their home that day. Can you imagine carrying that burden for decades?
It's heartbreaking to think about the long-lasting impact of these crimes, how they continue to haunt the victims' families even after justice has been served.
And then there's Bill Wieggerle, Vicky's husband.
Yeah.
He spoke about how his life was shattered the day Vicky was murdered, and how he was wrongly suspected for years. The pain and anger in his voice were palpable.
Bill's story is a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences of wrongful accusations. He had to endure not only the loss of his wife, but also the suspicion and scrutiny of his community for a crime he didn't commit.
Despite the family's pleas for answers, for some understanding of why he committed these horrific acts, Rader's apology felt hollow and scripted. There was no real remorse, no genuine acknowledgement of the pain he had caused.
It was as if he was going through the motions, offering a performance rather than a genuine expression of regret. His lack of empathy was truly chilling.
In the end, Rader was sentenced to 175 years in prison, ensuring he would never see the outside world again.
While justice was served, it's important to remember that the scars of Rader's crimes run deep within the Wichita community. The fear he instilled, the lives he shattered, left a lasting impact on the city and its people.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but let's pause for a moment and try to make sense of it all. How did Dennis Rader, a seemingly ordinary man, manage to commit such horrific acts and live a double life for so long?
It's a complex question with no easy answers. But I think we can start by looking at Rader's psychology, his motivations, and the factors that allowed him to operate undetected for decades.
Great. That's exactly what I was hoping we could delve into next.
Yeah.
So let's take a closer look at the man behind the mask, the mind of Dennis Rader.
All right, let's get into it. One thing that really struck me about Rader's confession and his behavior throughout the investigation was his strange sense of pride and accomplishment when discussing his crimes.
Oh, absolutely. He seemed to relish the attention, the fear he inspired. Remember, he even gave himself the moniker, BTK, as if he were some sort of anti-hero. It's like he wanted to be infamous to leave his mark on the world, even if it was through acts of unimaginable cruelty.
And that desire for recognition, for notoriety, seems to have been a driving force behind his actions. It's a disturbing reminder that for some, the allure of infamy can be a powerful motivator.
It's like he wanted to be remembered not just as a killer, but as BTK, the mastermind who outwitted the police for decades.
His confession wasn't a display of remorse, but rather a twisted self-aggrandizement. He meticulously recounted the details of his crimes, showcasing his control and dominance.
And there's that creepy detail about how he reassured his wife about BTK. He told her not to worry, to keep the doors and windows locked, because he knew he was the one doing the killing.
It's a chilling example of his manipulation and the distorted reality he lived in. He saw himself as both the perpetrator and the protector, playing a dangerous game with the lives of those around him.
One of the experts in the podcast even suggested that Rader was likely planning to eventually reveal himself, to take credit for his work.
That theory is particularly unsettling because it suggests that he saw his crimes as some sort of twisted masterpiece, something to be admired and acknowledged.
This case really makes you think about the nature of evil and the challenge of identifying those who harbor such darkness.
Right. It's a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that even the most seemingly ordinary individuals can be capable of unspeakable acts.
And that brings us back to the question of how he managed to live this double life for so long. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the answer lies in a combination of factors. First and foremost, Rader was a master manipulator, a chameleon who could blend seamlessly into any environment. He was also incredibly meticulous and organized, which allowed him to compartmentalize his life, keeping his dark side hidden from his family, friends, and community.
So he was basically living two separate lives, carefully constructing a facade of normalcy.
Yeah.
While secretly indulging in his dark fantasies.
Exactly, and for a long time it worked. He was able to deceive everyone around him, even those closest to him. But eventually his need for control, his desire for recognition, his ego, if you will, got the better of him.
And that ultimately led to his downfall. The desire to be seen, to be acknowledged as the mastermind behind these horrific crimes, proved to be his Achilles heel.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that even the most cunning and meticulous criminals can be undone by their own arrogance.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful discussion so far, but I think we need to take a break and process all this information. When we come back, I want to delve deeper into Rader's psychology, explore the factors that might have contributed to his dark path, and examine the role of true crime media in this case. Stay with us. Welcome back. We've been unpacking the chilling story of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, and how he managed to keep his horrific acts secret for so long. Before the break, we were talking about his arrogance and need for control, but I'm really curious to dig deeper into his psyche. What can you tell us about his psychological profile?
Well, it's fascinating how someone like Rader could exist in plain sight, fooling everyone. One of the keys to understanding him is the concept of compartmentalization. It's a psychological defense mechanism where someone separates different parts of their life, keeping them isolated from each other.
So he's essentially building mental walls between his normal life and his dark fantasies and actions.
Exactly. He's a father, a church leader, a seemingly upstanding citizen in one compartment, and then in another, he's BTK, the orchestrator of horrific crimes. This compartmentalization allows him to function, even thrive in his public life, while simultaneously indulging in his dark urges.
That's terrifyingly efficient.
That's it.
It's almost like he's leading two entirely separate lives.
In a way, he was. And to maintain this separation, he had to be incredibly organized and methodical, not just in his crimes, but in every aspect of his life.
You mentioned earlier that there were warning signs in Rader's childhood, even if his upbringing wasn't overtly traumatic. What should we be paying attention to in those early years?
One thing that stands out is what's known as the McDonald triad. It's a set of 3 behavioral traits in childhood that have been linked to potential for violent behavior later in life: bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals.
Okay, and Rader displayed that last one, right? He talked about having a fascination with inflicting pain on animals as a child.
Yes, and while the McDonald triad is not a foolproof predictor of future violence, it does suggest a potential for a lack of empathy and a desensitization to suffering, which are certainly evident in Rader's crimes.
So these early signs, combined with his later obsession with Harvey Glattman and his collection of those disturbing magazines, suggest a pattern of escalating darkness in his fantasies and desires.
Absolutely, and it seems that true crime media, especially the sensationalized stories of other serial killers, played a significant role in shaping his worldview.
You know, before the break, we touched on the influence of true crime media. Do you think exposure to these stories can actually contribute to someone becoming a killer?
It's a complex question, and there's no simple answer. While the vast majority of people who consume true crime content don't go on to commit violent acts, there is a concern that for individuals who are already predisposed to violence or who are struggling with dark fantasies, exposure to these stories can potentially fuel their desires or provide them with a blueprint for action.
So in Rader's case, his fascination with Glattman's crimes, his mirroring of Glattman's methods, suggests that true crime media might have served as a sort of twisted inspiration for him.
It's certainly possible. It's also worth noting that Rader was very aware of the media coverage surrounding the BTK case. He followed the news, read the articles, listened to the reports. He was, in a way, living out his fantasy in the public eye, even if his identity remained hidden.
That's just so creepy. It's like he was getting off on the attention, the fear, the speculations surrounding his crimes.
And that brings us back to his ego, his need for recognition. It wasn't enough for him to commit these acts. He needed the world to know it was him. He needed to be seen, acknowledged as the mastermind behind these horrific acts.
Right, and ultimately, that need for recognition led to his downfall, his arrogance, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else made him careless.
He became so caught up in his game, so confident in his ability to outwit the police that he let his guard down.
And the rest, as they say, is history. Speaking of history, I think we need to revisit the question of Paula Rader. Could she have been completely unaware of her husband's double life?
This is a difficult question to answer definitively. There's no denying that Rader was a master manipulator capable of deception on a grand scale. It's possible that he was able to keep his dark side so compartmentalized that Paula remained oblivious.
But on the other hand, how could she not have noticed something? The evidence found in their home, the mother lode at his office, his strange behavior, his absences.
Those are valid points. It's hard to imagine that someone living in such close proximity to Rader wouldn't have picked up on at least some clues.
And what about those times when he would reassure her about BTK, telling her to keep the doors locked because he knew he was the one doing the killing? How can anyone interpret that as anything other than an admission of guilt?
It's a disturbing detail, and it certainly raises questions about what Paula knew or perhaps chose not to know, it's possible that she was in denial, unwilling or unable to accept the horrifying truth about her husband.
Or maybe she was afraid of him, afraid of what he might do if she confronted him.
That's also a possibility. We know that Rader was capable of violence and that he had a need for control.
Yeah.
It's not unreasonable to think that he might have used intimidation or threats to keep Paula silent.
It's a complicated and troubling aspect of the case,
Yeah.
and I don't think there's a clear-cut answer, but it's something we have to consider as we try to understand the full scope of Rader's deception and the impact of his crimes on those around him.
Absolutely. The BTK case is a reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places and that even those closest to us can be capable of horrifying acts.
It's a chilling thought, but one that we can't ignore. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from Rader psychology to the role of true crime media to the question of Paula Rader's knowledge.
It's been a fascinating and disturbing exploration of a truly complex case.
We've delved into the depths of Rader's mind, trying to understand what drove him to commit such heinous acts.
We've analyzed his meticulous planning, his compartmentalization, his need for control, and his twisted sense of pride.
And we've examined the impact of his crimes on his victims, their families, and the entire community of Wichita.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think there's one question that lingers. What lessons can we learn from the case of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that we'll explore in our final segment. Stay with us. Wow, this deep dive into the BTK case has been a real eye-opener. It's one thing to read about these cases in the news or watch documentaries, but to really dig into the details, to hear the voices of the victims and their families, it hits differently.
I agree. It's easy to distance ourselves from these kinds of stories, to see them as something that happens out there. But the BTK case is a stark reminder that evil can lurk anywhere, even in seemingly ordinary places like our own communities.
And before the break, you posed a really thought-provoking question. What lessons can we learn from the case of Dennis Rader? I mean, what's the point of exploring these dark corners of human behavior if we don't come away with some understanding, some takeaway that might help us prevent such tragedies in the future?
Exactly. So what can we learn? First and foremost, the BTK case underscores the importance of vigilance. We can't afford to be complacent, to assume that our communities are immune to this kind of darkness.
It's easy to think, oh, that would never happen here. But Rader was a master of blending in, of appearing completely normal. He fooled everyone for decades. It's a sobering reminder that we can't always judge a book by its cover.
Right. We need to be aware of the warning signs, the subtle red flags that might indicate someone is struggling with dark impulses or engaging in harmful behaviors. And we need to create a culture where people feel comfortable coming forward, reporting suspicious activity and seeking help if they or someone they know is in trouble.
We also talked about the role of true crime media, and I think that's another area where we need to be mindful. While it's important to learn from past cases and raise awareness about these kinds of crimes, we have to be careful not to sensationalize violence or inadvertently glorify those who commit these acts.
Absolutely. We need to strike a balance between informing the public and avoiding the kind of voyeuristic fascination that can potentially fuel unhealthy obsessions or even inspire copycat crimes. The focus should always be on the victims, their stories, and the search for justice.
I think it's also crucial to remember that behind every case, every statistic, there are real people, families, whose lives have been shattered. The impact of these crimes ripples outwards, affecting not just the immediate victims, but entire communities.
That's why it's so important to support organizations that work with victims of violence and their families. They provide essential services like counseling advocacy and legal assistance, helping people navigate the complex and often overwhelming aftermath of these traumatic events.
So to wrap things up, I guess the key takeaways from this deep dive are vigilance, awareness, responsible consumption of true crime media, and support for victims and their families.
Exactly. And I'd add one more, the importance of hope. As dark as this case is, it's also a story of resilience, of a community coming together to heal and rebuild.
You're right, despite the unimaginable pain and loss, there's a sense of hope in the stories of the victims' families. Their determination to honor their loved ones and fight for justice. And that, I think, is a powerful message to take away from this deep dive.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, this has been an incredibly informative and thought-provoking discussion. I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the chilling case of the BTK killer. We encourage you to continue exploring this case and to reflect on the lessons we've discussed today. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.